It's a kind of an intersection. We are all intersections of several different things.
From this house, that house looks like a ship. Through these windows, those shingles are fins for a finer air, a fiercer atmosphere. From Massachusetts looks like Earth, like it came first, in a time when not every tree was asked to make fruit.
I grew up in Argentina, and I lived in many places. And I studied in Argentina and in New York at a time when, there were like big names and important people, and that meant something. I don't think these days that means as much. And then I taught in Pittsburgh for a couple of years. I had great friends there. And then I went to Davis, and I remained there for the following 30 years. So the place where I have lived the longest is Davis, my life. Longer than in Argentina. I wanted to study with Mario Davidovsky, so I went to Colombia and I spent 8 years in New York. I was there probably longer than I needed to be. It was very hard to leave the city. It was like, when you leave New York, it feels like it's the end of the world. There's no other place like New York. When you live in New York, you don't conceive of life anywhere else. So when I went to Pittsburgh, it was like a lesser New York. It was a place that had been an empire, but it was empty. It had a Carnegie Museum and a Mellon Museum, and Carnegie Mellon University. It was like the epitome of the extremely rich industrial past of this country. But it had been, by then left behind, and the very last steel mills were being dismantled at the time, and the city was turning into something else, which is what it is now. So I got a phone call from Ross Bauer, and he said, "Are you interested in coming to Davis for a job?" And I said, "Why not?" We moved to Davis in 1994. We stayed there ever since. Because we were city people, and Davis has no architecture. There were no differences between, people talked about East Davis, South Davis. I couldn't tell the difference. So we got lost all the time because there were no, eventually we learned to see the plants, There was this big willow. It was about 3 blocks away from our house. So when we saw the willow, it was like seeing, I don't know, the New York Public Library, the lions. New York is a very addictive place. And, going away from New York is like being plucked out, away from an addiction. Even now, I go to New York and I feel at home, immediately. I don't know that I would like to live in the city now, after all these years.
Yeah.
I never got that feeling, with San Francisco. But I was fascinated by LA. It's a different story. But New York is something else. It's a place where, you feel at home immediately. nondescript as far as, I mean, it's New York, right? I went probably hundreds of times to Paris, and I speak French reasonably well. But somehow, even though you can feel at home in Paris, somehow, you will never be from Paris, right? New York, on the other hand, you are from there because you know, it's so kind of, it belongs to everybody. It's a world city, if there is one. Mm-hmm. Maybe Shanghai is like that, who knows? Upbringing was a little different because since I came from Argentina and I came to do my doctorate, so I was already a person. You know, I had studied composition, I had spent time in Europe, so there were things I didn't know, and there were things that I knew that the people at Columbia didn't know. I mean, I came to New York at a very particular time. That's when the Chinese came to New York. So I was contemporary with Chen Yi and Su Long and Tan Dun and all of those people. They were my classmates. I knew them very well. I was TA at the Electronic Music Center, and Chen Yi was my student. And it was fascinating because she knew Ginastera, but she didn't know early music. She didn't know Josquin. Because in China, the Western music that they had was completely random. So they knew Ginastera well. I mean, Ginastera was famous, right, at a certain point. But they didn't know Josquin, they didn't know anything before, let's say, 1600. But, you know, all of those people were my classmates. And that was the generation when, you know, people, I think in the previous generation, maybe in the 70s, they were like conservatory trained and they knew all the music and they, you know, their sort of basic bread and butter was, you know, the 9 symphonies and, I don't know, the 32 sonatas, you know, and the string quartets and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. You know, for my generation, everybody had like a garage band, a kind of a rock and roll past that were trying to hide very carefully. You know, this is early 80s, right? Another classmate was a woman who was the daughter of a very, very famous pediatrician. And she had a band that played at CBGB's called Hide the Babies. So it was different in the sense of the, you know, being subject to these influences. I mean, everything was less serious than, you know, the generation immediately before. But that's beginning of, you know, major influence from other types of music, from rock, from, you know, jazz, from that began to happen with people that are my age. So I don't think it was that relevant, the downtown, uptown thing. I mean, I liked Steve Reich. You know, I interviewed Steve Reich for a Swiss magazine when I first came to New York, and I was still, you know, a student of Davidovsky's. I mean, I could see that there was a tension there, but the tension did not translate into the people my age, at least not that strongly. And what I tell my students is that, you know, there's one Fernigau and there's a million Fernigau students, and nobody's going to take 5 years to learn a Fernigau student's piece. However, they will take 5 years to learn a Fernigau piece. And, you know, that's not Fernigau's fault. I mean, it's not his fault that he's tremendously charismatic and everybody wants to be like him, you know, to the point that people, you know, they start wearing like yellow shirts and they study Fernigau. But, you know, it's something that would never happen nowadays because you have, you know, so many different influences and so many different people, and everybody's happy with what they do, you know. We don't need a school. I mean, we have a school. We don't need a school of that has aesthetic boundaries that are we are new complexity or we are new simplicity or we are black and math. We thrive in the opposite, and it's nice because when we have student concerts, they're so diverse. You never get bored listening to the same piece over and over. Yeah, but another thing that I think influenced me quite a bit, and it kind of shows in the pieces, in the songs, is that I went to a Catholic university, and one of the main subjects that we studied was, Gregorian chants. And the Gregorian chants professor was an amazing singer. The mix of that and all the counterpoints and all the ancient 1400s, even 1300s and onwards, music was a big influence. And I kind of think in those terms a lot. I like to write lines that are somewhat, I don't want to use the word natural, but that are not tremendously edgy. Try to make sure that the texts are understood, because otherwise, why use a text at all? I hope the texts are understandable, and I hope the lines are singable. Teacher who told us, talking about this, that you shouldn't choose the absolute best text or the absolute famous text. For instance, if you want to set a text in Spanish, the last thing you want to do is go to, let's say, Pablo Neruda's, 20 poemas de amor, quiero escribir los versos más tristes esta noche. That you cannot set that. You may attempt to do it, but somehow the text cannot be so well known. There has to be a relative size to what the text is and what you can do to the text. So you have to find a text that is, that attracts you in some way, but it doesn't have to be something completely unattainable. You find that you can do something with that text. But, in doing so, you don't destroy something that is precious or fragile, or you find some affinity. It may not be equal. It may be that the text is much better than your song, and yet it has to be better like here, not like here. There are so many great texts by people who are not that well known. So the other thing is, if you set, let's say, that text by Neruda, everybody may have an idea of how they would want that text to be set, because everybody knows that text and it's been, in the public consciousness, So you're going to be wrong no matter what you do, because whatever you do with it will not be the idea that 90% of the people who know that text would be doing with it. It's a recipe for disaster. The other dead poet that I said a lot of texts by was Thomas Hardy. But Thomas Hardy is like a classic. He wrote so many poems that, even though you may spend the rest of your life studying Thomas Hardy poems and you will never get through all of them. So that gives you some leeway, Mm-hmm. It's possible that people would not know a certain poem by Thomas Hardy. But I said a lot of living poets, yes. People that I know, people that I like, and people whose poems, speak to me.
Played between us to and fro.
about a month ago, I had dinner with Haas, Robert Haas, and that's a question that I asked him. And I asked him because I wanted to know how poets feel about composers, because it's a bit of an intrusion in your thing. I mean, it's a big question, because my question to him was, do you mind when composers set your poems? I mean, how do you feel about it? Because you're taking something that is very personal, it's like a finger. You put a different ring on the finger. Maria Negroni, she was fascinated with the idea, and eventually she had a kind of an opera that was written by another composer, done, and she loves the fact that someone is setting the poems. And it's an entirely different. I mean, when we talked about it, it's like she sees, of course, her poems under completely different lights. Katie Peterson, you were there when she heard at least two of these songs for the first time, and I believe she was moved. I haven't talked to her. I think she's on sabbatical, or I'm on sabbatical too, so I haven't talked to too many people in the last 3 or 4 months. A poem is something that you see laid out in a certain way. That's very important to your perception of the poem, right? I mean, you hear it in your minds because you see it graphically take a certain shape, so that shape translates into some shape in your minds. And I think that's very important when you set a poem. I think most of all, when you set a text, you create another super set of associations, which works in a completely different realm. And that set of associations with pitches and harmonies and sounds operates in parallel with everything else, and sometimes in tandem with everything else, and sometimes against everything else. And that's a choice that you make when you're setting the poem. You can choose to respect the lines, and you can choose to contradict that here and there for some reason, which could be a sound reason, or it could be a meaning. We were talking about the relationship between Easter and Massachusetts in my setting of the poem, and Easter not thought of the crucifixion and the resurrection, but Easter thought of Eastern, and therefore the same pitches that I use for Massachusetts, right, are the same pitches that I use for Easter in that piece. I mean, they're all, and that's an entirely different set of associations that operates in an entirely different realm. And I think that's the fun of setting poems, because you create these other structures. Most of my experiences with living poets, like with Adam Zagajewski, for instance, he was absolutely fascinated. I mean, he was kind of dazzled by the sound, and that was an entirely different set of associations, because I wasn't setting the Polish, I was setting the English translations by Claire Kavanagh. But he was like, when you can see that someone is blinded and yet fascinated and extremely happy in the end. But it was like a mind-boggling experience of sorts to hear his poems. I started, my career as a composer in Argentina as a composer for film and theater. And there are two things there. One is that, the director knows better than you what the music is going to be for. So the director's vision prevails always. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the music that they choose is not the best music, but it's the music that works best for that person's vision. That's a really good lesson. I really think that everybody should write music for films and music for theater, every composer, because what works dramatically in that medium is not always what works best in the music itself. And in fact, most of the times, you're puzzled because you wrote this thing that took you like 8 hours to put together 3 measures, right? And they say, no, this doesn't work. I mean, this stupid thing that you wrote in 10 seconds, it even took longer to put it on paper than it took to think about it, right? They say, this is what I want. And then you see the thing and it works. It works much better than this other thing that, you spent so much brain, time and power coming up with. But, it's strange because I also had music used most recently in a documentary in Argentina. There was a piece that I had written for a friend in Switzerland, and he sent it to the director. And it was a very complicated exchange of emails. And then they sent me the film, and it was a film about some caves where there were, paintings from prehistoric paintings. And I never thought that my music could be used in that context. This was an instrumental piece. It kind of worked, but it was very strange to hear that. And they used the same fragment over and over again. That's another thing. It was not like they used a piece. They used bits and pieces of things. What fascinates me with diva music is how relatively close it is to us. I have an example. I wrote this piece for choir, for male choir and organ, on writings by Notker Bagulus. And there is a text by Notker. He wrote The Life of Charlemagne, supposedly. He writes this text where he says, this is what a toothless man of a certain age, and, basically he's telling you, I'm pretty much done, but this is what I was able to do, and I'm proud of it. And that text is so close to a human from the 21st century, right? I mean, you can see, you can feel that you know the person. And that text was written around 900 or something like that, and that's a fascinating thing about, I mean, even though you don't know how it sounded, when you play it or when you look at the scores, you feel the connection. And the connection is very strong. I mean, you can see that these people were using, fourths and fifths and thirds, but they were coming up with stuff that still speaks to you. And they were setting texts in amazing ways. So I think that's absolutely fascinating. How these things survive, 300, 400, 500 years. And they're so immediate. You feel like you're talking to the person. I mean, the question is narrative. There's good narrative, in any stuff, and there's narrative that doesn't gel, doesn't make sense, right? So even the most abstract piece of music, if it has a coherent narrative that makes sense and gels, I always think of Stockhausen, and his narratives. I mean, his pieces are, vastly different from each other. And the procedures and the techniques and everything is vastly different. But his narratives always make sense. All these Klavierstücke. I mean, that's a perfect example. I mean, there's so many pieces that are so different, and yet, they make perfect sense. You have to have a vision of the whole, and where the thing happens. As I told you the other day, people dress a certain way, and they like certain foods, and they like, stick shift cars, and, kind of curates your own image, right? And your own music and everything else. But it's all choices, things that you like. I mean, do you like certain things more than others? I mean, I have blue clothes, not red. And I think I feel that that's the case with the songs that you're putting together. Eventually you're going to have an enormous collection of songs. So I'm looking forward to that.